We are at the close of the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity, which has its origin in the movement about a century ago, or more by now, with l'Abbé Couturier and so on in France and other places, frowned upon in certain circles, but an early intuition given to privileged souls that the way ahead was not in heavy artillery, but in a gentler mode. An intuition which came through loud and clear in the document Unitatis Redintegratio of the Second Vatican Council, and also in the document on the nature of the Church itself, Lumen Gentium, which many will be studying in this year of faith. In the case of Lumen Gentium, it is put in the form of, as it were, concentric circles. The true church subsists in the one true church founded by our Lord in the form that we know it. But grace diffuses from its center, and so there is a relation on the periphery. But the tendency is always, if it's authentic, towards the center and not away from. Question mark. What happens when a person is fighting against the Catholic Church, but yet is praying? It is the case of many of our evangelical brethren. It was the case, it seems, of Bruno Conicioli, who in the 30s and 40s was heading away from the Catholic Church, and eventually in such a dramatic way that he was keen on, I think, attacking the Holy Father himself. He was fulminated in a situation not dissimilar to that of St. Paul, whom we are feasting on this very day. It was at Tre Fontane in Rome, nearly opposite a place already sanctified by prayer for many centuries, going back, of course, to the martyrdom of St. Paul. 3 fountains, Tre Fontane. His head bounced 3 times, and 3 miraculous fountains sprang up. But they are therefore there venerated until the end of the world, but in a place which is housed by a community of monks, Trappist monks, one of the 2 in the Roman area, colonized from France, from La Grande Trappe. So one day in 1947, Bruno was up to his mischief, and he was concocting something terrible. He was struck by a light from heaven in which he saw a lady, and he was told that he was actually fighting against the church, and that the true church was the one that he was fighting. It is called La Madonna della Rivelazione, the Madonna of the Revelation, and it's one of those occasions when formally and literally heaven is saying that the Catholic Church is the true church. It has happened also in other situations. It happened in prison in the mid-40s, likewise. Newman, it was Claude Newman, who was a black man on death row, and he, having put on the miraculous medal from somebody who was also in the prison, who didn't want it, was given to understand at midnight by an apparition of this lady whom he didn't know that the Catholic Church was the true church. She was nothing at all, not baptized, and he couldn't read, and he was to ask for instruction from a Catholic priest. Heaven again, a Blessed Lady, saying quite clearly where the truth was. Now, this gospel that we have just read does speak of signs that will follow those who believe. And we must respect that those signs are to be found outside the parameters of the Catholic Church, some of them. When sincere prayer is around, God is generous and zooms in, and they do find healing. Sincere evangelicals and so on, for God is on side and not off side when it comes to goodwill. But what you will not find is precisely this element of a miracle to underscore a dogma. That cannot happen. The closest that we get to it is the Eastern Church and churches. Now, they're bound to have a lot of the supernatural because they have the sacramental life and they have the true faith as it was before the split came in 1054. It's just it hasn't developed. Now, the great miracle that they have in the East, as well as tendentially certain types of miracles which they have proportionately more than we do, e.g. icons weeping and having this kind of things, because they're very much oriented towards icons, is the miracle of Easter, where they have the Hagios, the holy light which comes from heaven, in the hands of the patriarch on Holy Saturday and lights his candle. And they, of course, would tend to argue from that, therefore that's a sign of the true church. But it doesn't work like that, because God has always done it in the hands of that one man since the times of James. Therefore it has to be in continuity, and God would not create a civil war in Jerusalem through changing the program. God is a wise man and has been around long enough to know how to handle these things, so you can't draw a dogma out of that. It just proves the resurrection, that it's an ongoing miracle, and the power is there and manifests itself every Easter in that miracle of the holy fire. Now, I want to go into the case of one person this night for a few minutes, for the simple reason that I had to look him up in some detail because of a talk I was giving in Dublin yesterday. It is the now uniquely beatified John Henry Newman, uniquely insofar as the Holy Father has delegated beatification but kept this one for himself, and we have an intuition why. He would like to see him eventually not just beatified, but canonized and made a doctor of the Church, because he, Ratzinger, is one of the finest theologians the Church has ever known and knows his importance in theology, Newman. And this Newman, as I was having to explain yesterday, in the University Church, which he built, is a very interesting phenomenon, precisely on this issue of light. Light. Lead kindly light, which we still sing often at Compline. Now, if one looks into the soul of Newman, one observes something similar to Paul of Tarsus, goodwill, but so conditioned, not by the Pharisees, but by the Anglican Church, that anything papist could but be off-centre. The purity was in the reform conditioning. And that is what a child is into. He takes what he receives. But he was faithful to that light which he had. Proof. All he writes and says about his early days as a student and an Anglican ordinand and young curate show that he was very sincere to every grace that came his way. And it is also interesting that pretty early on he had the intuition of the importance of celibacy. Now, he, therefore, when it came to being ordained in an old church in Oxford, ordained in the Anglican sense, but not ordained in the Catholic one, he was able to act upon souls. He cared very much for souls and was a model pastor. Great care in the handing on of the word, great care in visiting people, qualities which are universal and which the Lord blesses. There is good will out there and good faith. So God judges, and there may be big surprises one day. It is that linear movement which carried on. Now, he was studying the Church Fathers and translating them. The Oxford movement was a return to the sources. And he was puzzled by the fact that he was observing uncomfortable parallels. He was finding himself in a situation of something similar to what had happened in Africa. The Donatists had the sacraments, but they were separated from the mainstream and remained so until Muhammad came along And because the church was divided in Africa, it did not resist the Islamic invasion. Now, he eventually saw that at one point, one critical point, it was no longer an intellectual game. He had been curious when he observed in small hidden corners and pockets of Catholicism, even in Britain, that their way of approaching the sacred was quite different from anything he'd known in the Anglican setup. You know, the Oxford and Cambridge system is very formal. But here he found very simple people in what he calls holy familiarity, kissing statues and crawling to the altar, things which he saw to be an expression of a very intense contact of the soul with its maker and the whole court of heaven, because there were other beings involved too, saints and angels. Now that was already making him uncomfortable, but it was still a curiosity. The thing changed when he was going through what he wrote at the time, and it's a very important writing. It's called an essay, but it's a whole book. And I was given it to read when I was a student by my spiritual father. And it's written when he's an Anglican. It's the essay on the development of Christian doctrine. Do you see how that's important, theologically? Now, what happens is that he's getting to the end of it still as an Anglican, and he's seeing where he's going. He's seeing where his thought is leading, but he's following it. What happens then, as well as a political event happening which made it clear to him in a way it hadn't been clear before, it was the decision by Parliament to appoint a bishop in Jerusalem for the Anglicans, the Lutherans and all Protestants. He saw then what was going on, setting up patriarch against patriarch and so on in the oldest of all patriarchates. And something else happened. He was beginning to see that this light that he was seeing was not a game of the intellect, it was divine. And it was becoming so clear that in one point of time the game ceased to be a game. It was henceforth salvation. Now do you see what's happening there? He had reached a point where the question was posed in a fundamentally different way. Can I remain where I am and be saved? I am seeing things. And he wrote Lead Kindly Light about that point because it was a homeward seeking. He had had an intuition that home was not in Canterbury, despite the gigantic structure, the whole nation, and all its roots. He went to Rome physically, and that was enough to separate him mentally for a while from Oxford and all that meant to him. And he saw there something else, and he liked it, strangely enough, to the extent that he wanted to bring it back, and he did, and even to Ireland. If you're in Dublin, go to St. Stephen's Green and wander into that church, which is always open, look at a bit of Italy. It's the same in Birmingham, which he built. It's the same in Brompton in London, which was built under his influence and that of favour. The two which they've since founded, Oxford and Manchester, are already churches which they've been given through prayer and providence. Oxford, the Jesuits gave it to them, and Manchester, the Church of the Holy Name, which is in the university sector, and is a very ancient and beautiful church that came to their hands through providence. So that's 4 foundations now, all through Newman's light. Now, when it came to choosing how to go about this, he had the intuition that there was a need in England for something that would speak to the person on every level. He wandered towards the Chiesa Nova, the new church, and the one that St. Philip Neri had built and gone into great trances of ecstasy in. Actually, he went into ecstasy in the chapel next to it, where I've celebrated. He would go into church, into the chapel, and go into ecstasy, and the altar boy would go out. He would come back 2 hours later, and then he would be able to carry on, and he would levitate. Now, Newman knew that Philip Neri was, as well as being seraphic, extremely warm and complete, able to get at the hearts of people through his humanity. Philip Neri was one of the most witty saints around, and cardinals knew where jokes were coming from. And in fact, the Cardinal of Milan, himself a saint, Charles Borromeo, would want his company so as to have a shot in the soul. He wanted the latest joke. And indeed, Philip Neri, to stop himself going sometimes into embarrassing ecstasies, would take a book of jokes to keep down on earth. And he would do all kinds of strange things in the Roman court, like shaving half his beard and appearing in public, ecclesiastical public of the time. But he knew more. The youth were important, and it's not for nothing that he's called the Apostle of Rome. He knew how to get the heart. Humour is a great channel, and so is prayer when it's spontaneous, hence the oratory, the place of prayer, but sincere prayer. And also what? It was not just by chance that the likes of Palestrina were made use of through Philip Neri. Great geniuses of creation of beauty and ending were harnessed. In came the greatest beauty that we have known in the West, and it was put to the service of the altar. So these oratories, and that's the case now in the four in Britain, are centres of what? Culture, beauty, and the closest we can get to heaven in the creation of modalities which suggest it. Because music is the language of beauty, and harmony is the echo of the Trinity. And its absence is a reflection of our culture. Look around. Look around. It's got better or worse since the Beatles. Even the young people don't know what beauty is anymore. I would like to conclude. This problem is very contemporary, especially in this week. We've been praying spiritually with all our brethren, and we meet them. We meet them actually far more than we think. Because you compare one Catholic and another Catholic next to each other in church, perhaps not talking to each other, would even extend the sign of peace, as a family feud, and who aren't really thinking about what's going on, and are swearing and smoking before and after, with two, perhaps one Catholic, maybe a nun or something, who loves the Lord a lot, and somebody who is way beyond the Catholic pale, but a Christian. There's more union there than in the first two, on the level of the soul and in God. The proof is Ratzinger, now Pope Benedict. One of his best friends is a Lutheran. I think he's now bishop. And he likes to have private and intimate talks with him. There's far more in common between them than between his soul and many, even, unfortunately, the bishop who criticizes him. Now, do you see in God how things are quite different? I would suggest then, at the conclusion of this prayer for Christian unity, that this is the true way ahead. It's far more real to discover what is there in God than to fabricate a shortcut towards its artificial realization, e.g. as what has happened just down the road here in Drogheda. We've had a savage concelebration, you know what I mean. Now, I won't go into that, but true ecumenism is not superficial. It's of the heart, it's of the soul, it's of God.
Jesus.